Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. My name is Jason Hepler. I am an academic technology specialist in the history department at Stanford University. And my role basically is to work with faculty and graduate students on research and teaching collaborations. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about one of those collaborations called Geography of the Post. It was a project I started with Cameron Blevins, who's a Ph.D. candidate in the history department. I wear a lot of hats at Stanford. Not only am I part of the libraries, part of our new Center for Interdisciplinary Digital Research, I'm also affiliated with the Spatial History Project. I'm affiliated with CESTA, which is the umbrella organization for these three labs. And that's sort of how I met Cameron. Cameron is a researcher within spatial history. And it was like probably in March of 2013, Cameron came to me and said, hey, I have all these post offices. Cameron's a researcher studying the 19th century West, looking at post offices. And he said, hey, I've got all these post offices. I want a way to visualize them. This was a great opportunity. I wanted to learn D3, so that was nice. And Cameron got a research collaborator. I'm also a historian of the West, so that helps too. Digital Humanities likes to ask, what do you do with 1 million books? Right? You have all these Google books and everything. I had what seemed like a simpler question. What do you do with 14,000 post offices? Right? Seems like small data maybe to some of you. It's actually for the humanities. This is getting pretty big. So we wanted to know what kind of insights could we get from visualizing the post. I'm going to talk a lot about history here. I'm a historian, I have to do that. But we have some D3 too. I'll show you the project we worked on. Talk about some of the design decisions that went into the project. And some of the reasons for the decisions that we made. And why I think, more importantly, why I think visualization is so important for the humanities. And visualization, after all, is a means of doing research, as Richard White would tell us, of posing questions we may not otherwise ask without the aid of computers, of identifying patterns that might otherwise go undiscovered. So the design of this project has gone through several iterations, and we were trying to solve a key question, which is how do we present data in a meaningful way? Plotting points on a map is a simple enough exercise. We could have done it in Tableau. We could have done it in Google Earth. And even that process of just plotting all these post offices can be rather arresting. As you'll see in just a minute when I show you the map, it's a big network. It's a lot of post offices in the West. And so it's really sort of stunning to see all these places. But I think we could do more. We wanted to do more, right? There's more than just putting points on a map. We wanted to represent knowledge. Iterations of the project are fairly straightforward. We started, of course, with Google. This is D3 and Google Maps playing nice together. This was like my first breakthrough in D3. And this was useful. It was useful for me because I started to learn how the technology worked. And it was useful for us as researchers to understand what we could do with these tools. What kind of things could we build? What kind of visualizations could we start to conceive? Sorry the projector is like, washes things out, but hopefully this all still works. We experimented with some alternative views as well. So we looked at hex binning, right, as a way to interpolate points on a map and actually bin these together to find geographical concentrations of post offices. Unfortunately, this didn't end up in the final version of the map. If you'd like to fork the project and contribute to the project, you can do so. I would bow down to you. It'd be great. But I think our data let us ask even more interesting questions than just looking at these concentrations of post offices. We had a question about where people were in the West. And to do that, we needed interactivity. This is a very old version of the design, but you'll see there's some echoes of this in the current version. And we had, in the humanities, what is a lot of data. We had 14,000 post offices. Actually, our entire data set now is 160,000 post offices for 2 centuries for the entire US. And it's complex, it's messy, and it's incomplete. Right? The kind of data you always work with in the humanities. So we focused on the latter half of the 19th century, looking at the western half of the United States, which in and of itself had a lot of scaling problems. Any of you who've plotted a lot of points on a map with D3 and then tried to make that interactive might know. As I painfully learned, it can be tricky to work with that much data. And in some ways, this data doesn't present a lot of challenges. It's all very similar, but it's not like a digital archive of text, for example, right? Text can be very different. It could be court cases, it could be newspapers, it could be diaries, it could be letters, right? Historian William G. Thomas calls this the document type problem. But we did have other design challenges. For example, we had to mesh together data sets. When Cameron and I first started, I showed you Oregon, and we had some other data for the West. We didn't have the whole West yet. Cameron's data set was incredibly rich, and you can kind of make it out here. Along the top, we have established, disestablished, reestablished, closed again. Cameron had data for dates for a lot of these post offices that they opened, they closed, sometimes they reopened, sometimes they closed again, maybe they reopened again. About 10 months ago, Cameron purchased a set of data from a stamp collector who had been collecting, information about these post offices for something like 30 years. And the reason he was doing this was because if he could track where a stamp went through, what post office it went through, it determined the value of that stamp. Now, this guy's data set wasn't nearly as rich as Cameron's. He doesn't have all this disestablished, reestablished data. The only thing we had was when it was opened and when it was closed. So we had to make a decision. We had to change our data infrastructure to say, okay, as great as it would be to have all of this richness here, we had to make a decision to only show when an office opened and when an office closed. And of course, we had to ask a really dangerous question at this point, right? Now we have the whole US. So we had to ask, where does the West begin? Right? See, among Western historians, that joke would have been so good. So here's the final product. I'm going to talk to you about a few things that's going on. Isn't this, hey, this is nice, right? Thanks. So the map does a few things, and I can show you here in just a second. But I'll explain some of the features before we do that. If you, as you might have surmised, if you mouse over a point, you get more data, right? This little thing pops up here, shows you what the post office is, when it was closed, and when it was established. The gold shows you the amount of time that that post office was open. The bar chart itself is showing the number of post offices per year. The stack shows how many were closed, which is the light blue, and how many were opened. The bar chart way over here is our attempt to represent fuzziness in our data. Like I said, humanities data, it's complex, it's messy, it's incomplete. There's a lot of places we can't georectify right now. Some of these towns only exist for a year, right? They're mining towns. They pop up, the mines run dry, they're gone. So we can't really georectify it. They're geolocated. In other cases, we just don't have date data, so we can't really represent that on the map in any significant way. But we still want to be honest with users that what they're seeing isn't always going to be all of the data, right? So we have this bar chart here that shows how many, the percentage of data that's mapped versus the percentage of data that's not mapped. There's manual zooming, these two buttons here. We did that again because with so many points on the map at one time, mouse wheel scrolling was unusable. Even panning today, if you use the project, it's a little jumpy. And there are tricks that get around that in D3. We could have suppressed the points as you interact with the map and then redrew them after you stopped. I pushed against that because I thought people would lose their sense of space when they started to do that with the map. So we kept the points on the map. The timeline itself has a brush. So if you brush over this, you can select an extent of time, any extent of time within our data set. It'll update the map and show you only those post offices that exist during that span of time. And we have two views, which are kind of hard to see on the projector, but if you check out the project. You can see it better. We have duration view, which is this default view, which has a transparency to the points. It shows the age of a post office. So the more transparent, the younger it is. And then there's a status view. And I think I'll show you these first. Here it is. So if we want to see post offices during the American Civil War, we can do that. The other view I mentioned is our status view. And the status view, again, it's a little hard to see, but we wanted to be able to represent the status of a post office at any period of time. So what that means is we've color-coded each of the post offices. So if a post office was opened at some point in time here, it gets this blue color. So there's a lot here, for example, in Utah. If it was closed, we represent that. If it was opened and closed within that same period of time, we represent that. Or if it was active before the brush and still alive after the brush, it's also color-coded. Zoom in. We can filter by post office. So if you only want to see the established post offices, for example, we can do that. Or only the disestablished or closed post offices. So that's the meat of the visualization. But now I want to talk a little bit about the history. Now, to be fair, I'm not a domain expert on post offices. This is Cameron's research, not mine. But he's been rubbing off on me. And so I have some ideas here that I want to share with you and try to make a case. One of the things we've been thinking about with the post office is that the post office can serve as a proxy for understanding communities in the West. Like I mentioned, many of these 19th century towns just died years ago. You can't find them on present-day maps, right? The West is known for its ghost towns, and you'll see a lot of them here. But I want to make a case as to why we should think about the post as a proxy for understanding communities and the significance of visualizing that process. Now, of course, there are ways that we could represent populations, right? The most popular, perhaps, is the choropleth map. But there's a problem with doing choropleths, especially in the West. Anybody know what that problem is? That's right. Cameron calls this the county problem. They're huge, right? They're huge counties in the West. Look at San Bernardino, right? Takes up almost the entirety of Southern California. There's no granularity there. You don't really know where people are at in Southern California. So let's look at an example. We'll look at an example from our data. Here's the population of the West in 1870, choropleth map, right? And you can see the problem, right? Where are people in the West? Central California, someplace in New Mexico. But we don't really know. We're going to focus on Colorado and New Mexico. And I need you to remember these places because we're going to return to them frequently. And again, like where are people? Do we really know? We can't really see it that well, right? There's people here, apparently a lot of people. But this county's a problem, right? Denver's included in here before it stretches over to Kansas. But it's visually a little bit hard to know, right? It's almost a misrepresentation of what the population's doing. So let's compare it to our map. Same map. Ironically, the projections are almost the same, which is kind of nice. What do anything stand out to anybody? Do you notice anything? Yeah, yeah. Right, so there's this corridor, right, running north to south. It's probably a railroad. Sorry, I don't have railroad data on here. This is probably a railroad. This is the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. But we get a better sense of where people are at, right? We can see, if we treat the post office as a community, we can get a better sense of where people are at. And actually, I think I didn't do it here, but if I'd map these two things onto one another, I think they'd line up pretty well. And to me, this is significant. As a historian looking at this, I go, yeah, if my question is where are communities at in the West, I can begin to see that. So the post is a proxy. It's a proxy for towns. It's a proxy for communities. You're not going to have a post office where there's no town, right? There's no post office that exists only to shuffle mail around elsewhere. These towns, often, or these post offices also were not frequently located next to railroads, right? The only way to get news and information distributed in the 19th century was to use the postal network, right? Its network of stagecoaches, railroad routes, and postal routes. And it's also a key part of the national government's process of folding the West into the nation, right? It's not this isolated region, but rather an integrated unit connected to this huge network. And this network connects the West to the larger social, economic, and political networks of the U.S. Now, maybe you don't believe me. Maybe you're looking at this and going, there's nothing here. There's no story. How can you treat a post office like a town? I'm glad you asked, because I have more evidence for you. I have to give a shout out real quick to Ben Schmidt, who's a historian at Northeastern, for showing me these maps I'm about to show you. In 1915, the Census Bureau published the Statistical Atlas of the United States. They've been doing this for a while. I don't really know the history of this. I think the earliest is in 1870 or so, but it's a regular publication. And this book is filled with beautiful visualizations. You can go find it on the Library of Congress's website. You should go check it out. It's sort of the golden age, right? We all think of the 19th century as the golden age of visualizations. I quibble with a few of the representations in here, but that's a different conversation. They include these awesome population density maps. And these are the maps of the US population density for 1870, 1880, and 1890. Here's 1890. This is a very significant map for lots of historical reasons, in part because the Census Bureau concludes in 1890 that the frontier has gone away. This is a big deal for 19th century Americans. Again, that's a different story. But I looked at these maps and I thought, does my postal data, does Cameron's postal data map onto this in any significant way? If the post offices do happen to line up with the census data, to me that's further evidence that I can treat these post offices as a town or as an indication of settlement. So let's look. We'll return to our corridor here in New Mexico and Colorado. This is it in 1870. I apologize that my projection is different from the Census Bureau's projection. But if you squint, you know, they kind of line up. And I look at this and I actually think they line up pretty well, right? I mean, look, I'm going to focus on a couple of little things. You'll notice this little blob up here by Denver. And you'll notice that little blob shows up on the post offices, right? We can see the spread of communities down here in New Mexico. Same thing's happening in the US Census map. We can look at Utah and Salt Lake City, right? Same deal. The US Census map has heavy population, lots of post offices. So here we have the West. 1890, heavy populations in California, Pacific Northwest, places in Colorado, New Mexico, Salt Lake City, some places up in Montana. Now my projection, again, is a little wonky, but if we focus on the coast, I actually think these two maps line up pretty decently. So, comparing post offices to other maps and other visualizations, I'd say that we could safely use the post as a proxy for understanding Western settlement. But the question is why is that important? Why have I spent all this time trying to convince you that it's safe to treat the post as a proxy for communities? If we look at if we look at what's going on, there's a lot more here than just the growth of communities, right? There's also the decline of communities, the death of places in the West. If we look at the progression of these maps, the Census Bureau is telling a story, right? It's a story of progress. It's a story of westward movement. If we return to our little corridor here in Colorado and New Mexico, here it is, 1870. Here it is, 1890, right? Lots of growth. You don't see any communities going away, except for the Indian reservations. What you don't see is the communities that don't thrive. This is the same spot, 1870 to 1890 in our data, and these are all places that closed in that period of time, all post offices that went away, communities that don't exist anymore. If the story I'm interested in is the process by which these communities grow and decline, it's these communities I want to look at. Again, you don't see this in the census maps, right? You see growth. The postal data gives us another view into what's going on. And I think therein lies one of the great benefits of visualization in the humanities. Census maps are static, right? They give us snapshots at particular moments, 1870, 1880. But our map lets you look at this data from any period of time in our data set between 1848 and 1900. You can look at any spot you want in any period of time you want. Maybe you're interested in settlement during the Civil War. Maybe you're interested in settlement during the Indian Wars. You can do that. You can look at these places, where they're going away, where they're growing. And what this map does is it leads me to further questions. It leads me to places on a map that are probably going to be overlooked by historians, especially if they don't exist anymore. For some of these places, the only evidence of them in the historical record might be a post office. If they weren't around very long, the Census Bureau didn't count them. There's no population data to actually record. What I see happening here, or what I would argue is happening, is a sort of distant and close reading, right? We talk about that in the context of text, but I think we could do it with maps as well. By stepping back and seeing overall patterns, we can then zoom in closer. We can literally zoom in and look at these things. But we can begin to track down more sources, track down more information, and give richness to the fabric of historical experience. Thanks.
I'm going to ask some questions before we move on to something completely different. Floor is open.
I have a question. So the post office no longer works as a population marker. Like, there are places where the post office is closing, not because the population's changed, just because of how people communicate having changed. Have you explored any other markers? Like, the first one that comes to mind is like cell phone towers, or can you speculate on what a contemporary substitute for this might be as we go forward?
That's a good question. We haven't explored that, but I do think that I think your idea of a cell phone tower is interesting. Although it may be the case that a cell phone tower exists to help relay that information to the next tower. So it may not map on as well as I think a post office does. I suppose if you wanted to look at like civic infrastructure, so if you were mapping like police stations or something, maybe that's one way to start doing it. I don't know though. It's not something we've looked at, I guess. But you could. Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, if you say overlaid the current highway system on top of those and seeing like how much continuity there's been versus are there just brand new paths that didn't exist, or are there previous corridors that got shortcutted somehow?
Yeah. That's a great question. I've done just a little bit of that. At least when we first started, of course, we were just using Google Maps, and so I was just throwing points on the map. And you do see the post offices of the 19th century sort of following modern highways, which kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to build a highway, you're going to take the land that's already been leveled out, either for a railroad or because that became a common way for people to move across mountains or plains or whatever. yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's anything known about traffic patterns of the stuff. Like, from a little distant town in the west, but most of them from the east.
Yeah. Like in terms of like the amount of mail going through a post office, you thinking, or?
Well, also, like, were people in these distant western towns, were they off from the east coast, or were they from all over, or like, who were they sending mail to?
Oh yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
Or is that all lost?
I would imagine some of that data is available, but I bet it would be really hard to capture. I could see, I mean, there's cases certainly where people examine correspondence networks. I mean, we could cite some of the stuff going on at Stanford with the Republic of Letters project. Certainly there are sort of famous people whose archives are getting digitized, so like William F. Cody or Willa Cather or whoever. And their letters would also indicate who they're sending letters to, and they lived in the West, and they would have maybe give you some idea of what's going on. But that would be a huge project, but it'd be really cool, yeah. Yeah.
I was under the impression that post offices were packet switching points. Don't they stop and then reorganize and then move on?
I don't know. I don't know if that's always the case. It may be for some cases, but again, I'm not a total domain expert in post offices, so I'm not.
Or there may be an interesting history with the evolution of FedEx and how they changed the hub
Maybe.
system.
Maybe,
That would
certainly.
be an interesting
Yeah.
moment. to
Yeah,
look
it would be. Yeah.
When you think about how you're visualizing post offices as a proxy for community,
Mhm.
how do you take into account the sort of political questions that, in other words, what communities do post offices represent? And, you know, you sort of raise that by saying American Indians,
Yeah.
you know, are those communities represented by these post offices? So
Yeah.
how do you represent that sort of, you know, problematic?
Yeah. So the map, so the map is, as it exists right now, does sort of flatten out those stories, unfortunately. And I'm not sure, I don't know how you'd represent some of that. I mean, certainly I would say, in the case of Indian reservations, you won't often see post offices, at least not very many. I don't think I have the map, but I know I have a map that Cameron made not too long ago, where he mapped all these post offices just on a regular map. And you note that there's a rather large lack of post offices in Oklahoma, which of course in the mid-19th century was Cherokee Indian territory. So I suppose in some ways when you visually represent these things, it becomes very obvious, because there's a rather stunning lack of post offices where you would expect there to be many of them. I suppose if you wanted some way to visually represent those offices that do exist in certain communities, I mean, I suppose you could make an intervention and say, categorize these offices as something, right? So if they exist on Indian reservations, you might say somewhere in the database, this is Indian, this is a reservation office, and we could represent that by color or something. In regards to some of the other political things that are going on, I don't have the data, but I know Cameron's been looking at wages of postmasters, which is a huge political patronage problem, and has been tying some of that data to these post offices to see who's getting a lot of money, who's not, and how that changes over certain presidential administrations. Sure. Yeah.
When you in your process, when you came across the decision point, do I go with a full data set or a complete data set?
Yeah.
Like, could you highlight some of the discussions that you had there, and what would it have afforded you had you had both?
I think if we had established and discontinued data for every post office, I think we'd have a much richer visualization, because I think you'd see. It'd be easier to pinpoint areas that go away and reappear much more frequently. In fact, there might even be a fifth color on that map that shows you, this place opened or reopened or something, which could be really interesting, because you could suddenly see there's a bunch of closures in Utah, and then they come back, and you might question why that is. And then it becomes an avenue for sort of looking at, what's happening. I mean, for us, it was, for us to make that decision, it was really, I mean, we didn't have all the data, and to get all that data would have taken a lot of time. I think Cameron's working on it, but again, with, now with a data set that's 160,000, that's going to take some time.
Maybe should we take one more and give Ian a chance?
Just give it over there, sure.
How about, yes, to be fair, how about both people?
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about the learning curve for D3?
So I didn't know any JavaScript or D3 when I started. And I would say I do a little bit of coding in Ruby, a little bit in Python, a little bit in PHP. I thought the learning curve was pretty steep. I mean, there's a lot there that the library can do. But at the same time, like, the community is really good, right? So, I mean, when I first started, I was learning through the blocks system that Mike Bostock built. So Mike Bostock's the creator of D3, and he has all these examples of how to build certain things in D3. And to me, like, getting started, this was fantastic, because it taught me how these things fit together. It taught me how to bind data to, web pages. But a lot of this, I mean, it took me a year to get this project done, in part because we had to deal with some rather tricky stuff. Some of it was the functions that handle the coloring of the points. Some of it's with the brush. The brush was my bane of my existence for a very long time. But you notice it, like, snaps to the edge of these rectangles rather than being very fluid, which is the normal way the brush works. But to actually, like, capture the year that you want, I wanted that snapping in there. So, I mean, it's yeah. But there are examples. So I suppose we could give a shout out to Elijah Meeks, whose D3 in Action book is excellent, so you should check it out. Yeah.
One question I had was, do you have any data set on literacy rates and how that maps to post office?
I don't. That'd be really interesting. Yeah, I don't. Yeah. Do one more? Sure.
Sorry. Related to one of the previous questions, you mentioned you ran into some performance issues,
Yeah.
especially with the zooming on the maps and the time. How did you work around those, and which of those were the most difficult to realize your vision?
Yeah. We tried for a long time to get it to work. The mouse wheel scrolling was so bad. I mean, it was so jittery that you couldn't use it. And even panning, if you pan the map today, it's still pretty slow. The way we got around zooming was to build manual zoom buttons, which was interesting. Talk about learning curves. Which I think helped a lot. I think it helps from a user experience because it makes sense, intuitive sense, to just click a button and zoom in and zoom out. I'd mentioned we had thought about suppressing the points, right? So we could just unbind all the data, just have the map, and then redraw everything when it's done. But again, I was really concerned that you lose your spatial reference when you start to do that. So the main, I guess the main way was these zoom buttons. I think we changed a little bit of the code in the way that these points are drawn. These aren't G elements; they're all SVGs. So it's just a lot of stuff on the screen at one time that browsers just can't quite deal with yet.